It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Happy Friday, everybody. By the end of tomorrow, we will know if Mayor Mamdani vetoes a pair of so-called buffer zone bills passed by City Council. The state legislature is considering its own protest buffer zone bills, and as of this week, so is Congress, with a bill just introduced by Tom Suozzi, the centrist Democrat, Queens and Long Island congressman. So, what is a buffer zone? Does it actually target protesters? And how are these bills different from each other? Well, simply put, these bills require protesters to remain a certain distance away from certain locations that the bills specify. Abortion clinics have been protected by such bills in the past, so the women entering don't get harassed or blocked from entering, right? Now, since the pro-Palestinian protests broke out in response to Israel's military action in Gaza in 2023, there are new proposals that would set up buffer zones around houses of worship and educational institutions. There have, of course, been acts of violence at some of these places that have done a lot to prompt these bills. The bills are hotly contested, though. Supporters, like City Council Speaker Julie Menin, say they're needed considering how some of these protests have gone to protect worshipers and others from injury, intimidation, and obstruction. Opponents argue that keeping protests too far from who or what they're protesting violates their free speech rights. Opponents include civil rights groups, some unions, and interestingly, Planned Parenthood. Let's get details now on the bills at the three levels of government and political analysis of the competing camps and the decisions facing Mayor Mamdani by tomorrow's deadline to veto. He has not yet announced his intentions. And, of course, we'll take your calls and texts. We have two journalists for this, Sahalie Donaldson from City and State, who covers City Hall, and Jimmy Vielkind, who covers New York State political issues for WNYC and Gothamist. Hi, Jimmy. Hi, Sahalie. Thanks for coming on.
Morning, Brian.
Morning. Thrilled to be here.
Sahalie, we'll start with you at the city level with tomorrow's veto deadline for the mayor. Can you explain the buffer zone bills that City Council has passed and why there are two separate ones?
Yeah, absolutely. So important context. These are bills that passed in part of a bigger package unveiled by City Council Speaker Julie Menin with the goal of tackling anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. These two buffer zone bills have been quite controversial from the start. So much so, they've actually been watered down quite a bit since their initial conception. For example, initially, those two bills would have required the police commissioner to set up fixed security perimeters, also known as buffer zones, up to 100 feet of every entrance and exit of houses of worship, as well as educational facilities. But following consultation with the city law department, this has evolved quite a bit. What the council ended up passing last month requires the NYPD to come up with a plan on how to create a security perimeter during protests around houses of worship and educational facilities. The key difference being no immediate action. This is just coming up with a plan. And these are two separate bills that would do essentially the same thing at two different locations. There's Intro 1B, that's the houses of worship one, which is sponsored by Speaker Menin, while the educational facilities one, 175B, and that is sponsored by Council Member Eric Dinowitz, who's a member of the Jewish Caucus and then a chair of the Education Committee as well.
So, Jimmy, what's in the state bill and how is it different from what Sahalie just described for the city council?
Well, there is one measure that has been proposed by Governor Hochul as part of the pending $263 billion state budget. And it doesn't do anything with regard to educational institutions, but it modifies an existing state law which already restricts protests and guarantees access outside houses of worship and abortion clinics. So existing state law already makes it a crime to obstruct access to those facilities, either facilities offering reproductive health care or houses of worship broadly defined. What Governor Hochul and some Jewish legislators have put forward is a fixed 25-foot buffer zone around the entrance to a house of worship or a facility providing reproductive health care. That's an important legal distinction because it's not just an abortion clinic. It's a facility providing reproductive health care, which is a pretty broadly defined definition. So this is pending in the state budget. There has been push back and forth between civil libertarians, and we will see where it lands. And I think that there are many eyes in Albany watching Mayor Mamdani to see whether or not he signs or vetoes one or both of these pending bills.
So listeners, do you have an opinion or a question or maybe a story pertinent to any of these buffer zone bills? Mayor Mamdani has until tomorrow, as we've been saying, to veto the ones passed by City Council that cover houses of worship and educational facilities, also known as schools. 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. Have any of you been on any side of this personally? Feeling endangered or intimidated, going to pray or going to school or going for reproductive health care of any kind? On the other side, have any of you been protesters at any such facilities and felt your free speech rights were threatened or that they might be in the future? What would you like the mayor to do? Anyone veto or sign one or both? Or who has a question for the journalists covering these bills? Sahalie Donaldson covering City Hall for the publication City and State, or Jimmy Vielkind covering New York State issues for WNYC and Gothamist. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Jimmy, I think your article on the state buffer zone bill suggests it was written somewhat in response to how City Council weakened or diluted its original bill, as Sahalie was describing. Am I overinterpreting that?
Slightly. These two have really proceeded on parallel tracks. But as Sahalie said, the city bill was really heavily watered down, removing any kind of fixed distance buffer zone from the legislation that really passed. These laws, Brian, really kind of popped into the public consciousness last year after protests at the Park East Synagogue in Manhattan. There was a presentation by Nefesh B'Nefesh, which is a group that facilitates moves of people from North America to Israel. And protesters outside chanted death to the IDF. They held signs that were broadly interpreted as anti-Semitic. One sign said, "Israel has no right to exist." And people were really horrified. I believe Commissioner Jessica Tisch even apologized for not doing more to sort of prevent this. So that was really the genesis of, as I understand it, certainly the state legislative effort, but also the city legislative effort, with people feeling that even though there are laws preventing an obstruction of access, that really no one should have to be forced to endure that if you're going to a worship service, a weekly worship service, etc.
Jimmy, here's an interesting question on that 25-foot rule in the state bill from a listener. Listener writes, what if a No Kings protest marches past, say, St. Patrick's Cathedral? Some marches will be within 25 feet.
That's a very good point, and it's something that Justin Harrison from the New York Civil Liberties Union brought up earlier in the week. I actually took it a step further. As I understand it, there's a big parade in honor of St. Patrick that goes right by that cathedral. So could that be somehow subject to sanction by the police if they wanted to? If we, for some reason, had a really pro-British police commissioner? I don't know if that's going to happen, but you never know. The actual language of the law, if you'll let me read it, is, quote, with intent to alarm and annoy anyone who seeks to enter, exit, work inside of, or use the services of either a reproductive health care clinic or a house of worship, such person demonstrates or prepares to demonstrate within 25 feet of distance from such facility, including its parking lot entrances, driveway, and driveway entrances of such facilities. So, the knock on this, Brian, is that this is really going to give quite a lot of latitude to police officers, be they the NYPD or other agencies around the state, because people have to discern what is the intent to alarm and annoy. What is a demonstration that is going to happen? So that has been the source of many of the objections, including the concern that this listener rose about having an unrelated demonstration perhaps be subject to restriction under this law.
And Sahalie, on the city council's bill aimed at protecting educational institutions in particular, listener writes, would an on-campus protest be allowed, or would protests need to be moved 26 feet off campus? Of course, the city bill doesn't specify a number of feet like the state one does, but the concept is the same. Could people protest on campus?
Possibly. It's really not clear. And that's one of the big reasons that critics of the bills are so concerned. There's a broad swath of people that are really worried about this. That includes left-leaning politicians, civil rights groups, students themselves. They've argued that this bill is an infringement of free speech and the right to protest. It's important to remember that college campuses have long been leading in any sorts of protests, including late last year during the wave of pro-Palestine protests. Colleges have always had a big role in this, as have schools. So people are certainly concerned on what implications this might have.
Listener writes, I do think it's important to note that protesters were not protesting outside a synagogue because people were worshiping there. They were protesting because there were illegal land sales being held inside of these synagogues. And I think the listener means illegal under international law because they pertain to land sales in the West Bank, which is considered occupied territory. So that's on one side, or one argument for being on the side of opposing the law. I think Aviva in Brooklyn is calling in to support it. Hi, Aviva, you're on WNYC.
Hey, I was calling just to say that this country is built on freedom of religion. It's one of the tenets of democracy. It's one of the reasons why America exists. You didn't have that back in England, and that's what this country was built on. And for me to have to feel afraid to go into a synagogue, I mean, even when these like land sale things are happening, there's minyanim, that's prayers that are taking place, and people shouldn't be afraid or have to go through aggressive shouting people that maybe want to hurt them because they want to go to pray. And so I'm sorry, but I don't think it's right for them to be there. I think that people should be, if they want to protest, there's plenty of political spaces to protest, but definitely not in front of a synagogue.
The no side, the please veto this bill side, would argue it's already against the law to harass people, to intimidate people, certainly to commit acts of violence against people. You said you might feel unsafe. So why would just keeping them away as a blanket act make you not worry about their freedom of speech?
I'll tell you that it already happened.
Unless you don't feel protected by the current laws.
I don't, because I already experienced this, that there was a land sale going on. I went in to pray, and it doesn't matter what reason I went into, but I went into the synagogue. For whatever reason I wanted to go into the synagogue, I was afraid to go in. There were people getting really aggressive, and shouting anti-Semitic things, nothing to do with the land sale. And it felt scary to go in, and I shouldn't have to feel that. It's a synagogue. A synagogue's a place of refuge. I shouldn't have to feel afraid to go into the synagogue.
Thank you for your call, Aviva. Really appreciate it. And here's a high school student who I think is concerned about how these bills would affect her. Emmy in Washington Heights, you're on WNYC. Hi, Emmy.
Hi. Thank you so much. So I'm a high school senior at the Bronx High School of Science, and we've had a lot of student protests. I mean, for climate change, we had a walkout for No King's Day. So I'm wondering, would this affect students that want to protest outside of the school or want to have a procession outside of the school to go somewhere else in protest of something?
Yeah, interesting question. Sahalie, do we know?
No, not really at this point. I think the idea would be to work that out, have the NYPD work it out in their plan. But I think the unknown nature of it all has raised all of these questions and has people very concerned.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
okay.
TBD. Emmy, do you want to say anything else?
That's it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I hope that student protests can be protected going forward.
Thank you very much for your call. couple of listeners, Jimmy, are asking why 25 feet in particular. And we're getting this from both sides. One who's suggesting that 25 feet is arbitrarily high. Another one writes, 25 feet is a joke, not enough space, to quote that text. And I'll throw in here that neither of you cover Congress, so I don't know if you're on this part of it at all. The third leg of government also now considering a buffer zone bill, but Queens and Nassau Congressman Tom Suozzi introduced that federal buffer zone bill this week covering houses of worship in particular, and that one is for 100 feet, 4 times as much as Hochul's bill. Are either of you familiar with that in any more detail, or how anybody is coming up with these particular distances?
You know, I think that the 25-foot number may have been with an eye toward legal precedent. The U.S. Supreme Court in 2014 struck down a Massachusetts law which created a 35-foot buffer zone around abortion clinics in which protest would not be allowed. So 35 foot's no good. Maybe 25 feet is a little bit less. I can't speak to Congressman Suozzi or to the initial city council picking 100. I also think that maybe politicians just like round numbers, and maybe someone had a quarter in their pocket, maybe someone else had $1 when they were writing the bill.
I'm going to play a few clips now of Speaker Julie Menin and Governor Hochul and their opponents just to further set these clips up. Sahalie, for you covering City Hall, the language of the City Council Houses of Worship bill claims that it strikes a balance. I'm going to read from the text of the bill. It says it's to establish a plan to address and contain the risk of physical obstruction, physical injury, intimidation, and interference at places of religious worship, while preserving and protecting the rights to free speech, assembly, and protest. So that's in the bill. It actually, Sahalie, references preserving and protecting the rights to free speech, assembly, and protest. So in general terms, before we play the clips, why isn't that enough for the opponents of the bill?
I believe that they find it to be a bit vague. It doesn't specify within the text of the legislation what that would look like exactly to protect those rights of protest. And people are worried that the interpretation of the NYPD will conflict with their own views and what they feel should be protected and upheld.
So here's City Council Speaker Julie Menin kind of minimizing what the bill does, largely because of how it hands off specifics to the NYPD.
That plan will determine whether a security perimeter is needed, and if so, how far the perimeter should extend from the entrance and the exit to the house of worship.
But here's New York Civil Liberties Union President Donna Lieberman objecting to exactly that, the decider role of the NYPD.
These security perimeters would give the NYPD broad discretion to censor speech, target protesters, and arrest dissenters.
So, Sahalie, what can you tell us about that aspect? Protesters often trust the NYPD less than they trust lawmakers. I think that's a fair statement. How much discretion would the NYPD have to treat different protests differently?
It seems like they would have potentially a fair amount of discretion. As you said, there's just not a lot of trust between protesters and the NYPD. We've seen this time and time again. There's a lot of trust lost, which again is leading to those concerns and why we're seeing such a strong reaction now against even this diluted version of the legislation.
Let's get a couple of more callers on with different points of view. Helen in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Brian. I want to offer a historical perspective here. In the 1960s, there was a very strong feelings on the part of anti-Castro Cubans who had made it to New York City, and people who were either pro-Castro Cubans or were certainly curious to hear a report at times in Town Hall of youth who had spent the summer working in Cuba. And I went to the meeting. I wanted to go to the meeting. So I came up at Times Square Station, and if it hadn't been for the police holding back a furious, screaming, enraged crowd of anti-Castro Cubans. I kept them isolated on that island in the middle of Times Square. I would never have been able to cross the street to get to Town Hall. I mean, it was incredible. And I am totally in favor of keeping people from being able to intimidate or physically threaten people who want to go somewhere like a school or a house of worship or an abortion clinic or whatever, feeling safe and protected. So how it's worded exactly, what distance is written into law, fine, let's work that out, but not the principle of protecting people. That's my statement.
Helen, thank you very much. On the other side of that, Kayla in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Hi, Kayla.
Hi. Hi, Brian. Thanks. I have been at these protests a bit more in the distance watching, and they're happening because of illegal land sales in Palestine, in the West Bank. And that is the main reason that these are happening. Most synagogues have the choice. They don't have to have illegal land sales. And some of the people in favor of this are missing that giant point. And we already have a lot of laws against protesting in this country. We don't need more things that restrict our right to protest. The NYPD is already at these protests. People can say what they want, but there is not violence. I have not seen violence on the side of the pro-Palestine protesters. And basically, there are anti-Zionist Jewish people at these protests. They're leaving that out. I have seen Jewish friends protesting that the synagogues are having these illegal land sales.
But the other side, and I'll just acknowledge without getting into the weeds on this, that a bit of a debate is breaking out in our text thread about what's considered legal or illegal land sales. But obviously these are land sales in the West Bank that many people object to and are seen in some ways as illegal under international law, for sure. But Kayla, I think the other side would argue that nobody's trying to restrict the right to protest against the land sales. It's a question of protecting the people who are going into the house of worship, if that's where, some of these land sale related events are taking place, from intimidation or physical injury.
Right.
The protest could be about anything.
Right, and I do see that happening. The NYPD already has those rights to do that and make sure they don't get violent on either side, because I've seen pro-Israel protesters also get very violent in this way and instigate.
Kayla, thank you for your call. Folks, we have some breaking news on this. I said at the beginning of the segment that Mayor Mamdani has until tomorrow to veto or sign these two bills passed by City Council, one setting up a procedure with the NYPD to establish security zones around houses of worship, the other pertaining to educational institutions. I didn't think this was going to come today at all, but the mayor just announced it. So when we come back from the break, the reveal. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So here we were in the middle of a conversation anticipating a veto or a signature by Mayor Mamdani by the end of tomorrow on two bills passed by City Council to establish a procedure. I don't want to misrepresent it by saying establish buffer zones, establish a procedure by which the NYPD would potentially establish buffer zones around houses of worship or educational institutions when there are certain protests that they might find potentially intimidating or harassing or obstruction or physically threatening. And the mayor just issued a press release. This came to my inbox at 10:14. And I'll give you the headline first, and then I'll read some of his language. He's signing the Houses of Worship bill, but vetoing the schools bill. So here we go from this news release. Today, Mayor Kwame Mamdani released the following statement on Intro 1B and 175B. It says, New York City will always uphold both the right to prayer and the right to protest. These two fundamental freedoms help define this city and the people who call it home. Last month, the City Council passed two bills related to these rights, known as buffer zone bills. Today, I am letting one of them go into effect and vetoing the other. The first bill is Intro 1B, which applies to houses of worship. It initially raised constitutional concerns. However, the final version of the bill that passed is narrower in scope and effect. It requires the NYPD to document its existing practices relating to protests near houses of worship. Following a thorough legal review, I do not believe it poses the same risks it once did, and that is why I will allow it to become law. That said, I disagree with its framing of all protest as a security concern. The second, Intro 175B, which applies to educational institutions, is meaningfully different, says the mayor. The problem is how widely this bill defines an educational institution and the constitutional concerns it raises regarding New Yorkers' fundamental right to protest. As the bill is written, everywhere from universities to museums to teaching hospitals could face restrictions. This could impact workers protesting ICE or college students demanding their school divest from fossil fuels or demonstrating in support of Palestinian rights. Intro 175B is not a narrow public safety measure. It is a piece of legislation that has alarmed much of the labor movement, reproductive rights groups, and immigration advocates, among others, across this city. Nearly a dozen unions have raised the alarm that its impact on their ability to organize. That is why I am vetoing this legislation. And it concludes, New York City has long stood as a place where people across generations and backgrounds can speak out, organize, and demand change. That tradition is essential, and we will ensure that it continues and that protection, prayer, and protest are guaranteed for every New Yorker. So that statement from the mayor just moments ago on the topic we're discussing. Sahalie, you surprised?
Kind of, that it came out today. I thought it might be more so tomorrow. I think if he was ever going to veto one of the bills, it was certainly going to be the schools one that has had the biggest opposition campaign. And importantly, it did not pass with a veto-proof majority, meaning this, in order to override the mayor's veto, the city council will need to shore up some more support for the bill internally. And it sets up a really interesting veto override battle, potentially. We'll have to see what Speaker Menin says if she decides to try and mount that fight.
Well, part of the politics here, as I've understood them, and my guests, if you're just joining us for this, are Sahalie Donaldson from the publication City and State. She covers City Hall. She was just speaking. And our Jimmy Vielkind, who covers state politics, because there are bills like this at both the city and state level. Sahalie, the politics, as I understand it, are that the bill that the mayor will let go through, the Houses of Worship one, did pass with a veto-proof majority in City Council. The education bill, the one that he's vetoing, did not. Can you say politically why the difference?
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I thought we lost your line there for a sec. Go ahead, Sahalie.
Apologies for that. Absolutely. The big difference is that the City Council's Progressive Caucus, which has grown this legislative session, voted by and large against the bill. And as a result, for the very first time in quite a while, the education bill needed Republican support to pass. I think also important to keep in mind that the Houses of Worship bill that did pass quite easily, I believe it had 44 council members voting in favor of it and just 5 against it. That was Speaker Menin's bill herself. She was the lead sponsor of that. That was really her baby. And there is not a lot of incentive for council members to go against that. It had a great deal of political strength behind it. I think this might have been somewhat of a matter of picking your battles, but also I think everything concerning schools and education tends to be particularly sensitive and draw particularly strong feelings.
A couple of things that jumped out at me from the mayor's statement that I sight read there. One line was, "That said," meaning he's letting the houses of worship bill go through. He wrote, "That said, I disagree with its framing of all protest as a security concern." So that's, I wonder if you can comment on that. I imagine Speaker Menin would say, no, this doesn't frame all protest as a security concern. The other thing, his language saying that he's allowing it, let me get the exact language again, letting it go into effect. That's not the same as signing it exactly, right? He said letting one of them go into effect and vetoing the other. So do you know if there's a distinction that he's signaling there, that he's not going to veto it, but neither is he going to sign it because he doesn't actually love it, but by not vetoing it, he lets it take effect? Or am I overreading that?
Yeah, I think that's very careful wording on the mayor's part. He's trying to minimize as much backlash as he possibly can. He's not signing the bill, which would indicate full-hearted support to those that have opposed it, many of whom are his ideological allies. And instead, he's just letting it go into effect. I think that, too, is maybe like a little bit of a generous interpretation. If he were to veto it, there's a good chance that the city council would have been able to override it. They do have the votes to do it. But I do think that's quite careful wording.
So back to the state bill. Jimmy, here's a clip of Governor Hochul speaking about her 25-foot buffer zone bill at the Park Avenue Synagogue recently. You're going to hear some music in the background here, but framing it as not just aimed at protecting Jewish worshipers.
And I felt hopeful yesterday when I was in my office in Albany and members of UJA came to talk to me about the plan to have the 25-foot buffer. And you know who was sitting with them? Were members of clergy from the Christian faith and the Muslim faith.
So, Jimmy, there have been violent attacks at synagogues, and there have been violent attacks at mosques. Anti-Jewish hate is a problem, and anti-Muslim hate is a problem, but the predominant protest movement these days is in support of Palestinians. So do you find that Muslim leaders are conflicted on this, or not so much? The governor there was trying to paint it as having support across religious lines.
I think that there are certainly divides within every religious sect. There have been Christian leaders who are very liberal and who lead protests from churches and houses of worship who have spoken out against this. You could also see others who have a more conservative bent being in favor of it. Of course, in other states, we've seen laws passed that restrict and criminalize the disruption of a worship service. That happened in response to demonstrations in Minnesota, where people were protesting a Christian pastor who also worked for ICE. So I think there are divides across the various religious fields, including among Muslim clerics. But what's been interesting to me is how the political left seems to be most willing to oppose these measures and to side with civil libertarian organizations like the NYCOU. We heard from Democratic Socialists, and of course, listeners know that Mayor Mamdani is also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, that they did not support this, that they're both because they are perhaps more likely to support protests in support of Palestinians and against the Israeli government than perhaps other people on the political spectrum. So I do think that this is not so much a clear religious breakdown as it is an ideological one.
Yeah, and to that point, I'll acknowledge a caller, Peter in Manhattan, who tells us he's a Jewish New Yorker who has protested at synagogues. He says this bill doesn't protect him from anti-Semitism. It discriminates against his viewpoint as a Jewish New Yorker. Jimmy, the state bill, and we have a caller on this. Margot, hang on. We're going to take your call in a second because I think it's relevant and interesting. The state bill specifies 25 feet between protesters and houses of worship, and also reproductive health care facilities. That is, places where abortions are offered, obviously, because anti-abortion rights protesters target those. Were they not already protected in a similar way under previous laws, the abortion clinics?
The existing state statute links both houses of worship and abortion clinics. And I will confess I don't know the genesis of this law, but it makes sense that in a time when New York state government was divided, where Republicans controlled the New York State Senate, or at times the Senate and the governor's office, that a move to protect abortion clinics would have to be twinned with a move to protect houses of worship. And I think another interesting point which came to light this week was that Robin Chappelle Golston, the president of Planned Parenthood Empire State Acts, an abortion rights advocacy group, said that her organization does not support the proposal to increase these buffer zones. Golston says that she is concerned that this new proposal, if it were to become law, would be subject to legal challenge, and that might undo the existing narrower anti-obstruction law that is already on the books.
And so now we get to Margot in Brooklyn, who's calling as a member of New Yorkers for Abortion Rights. Margot, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, Brian. Good morning. My name is Margot, and I'm a member of New York City for Abortion Rights. We, along with all major reproductive health and justice orgs in New York State, oppose the buffer zones at both the city and state levels. In addition to the reasons that were actually just mentioned, I want to highlight that protests outside houses of worship have for decades allowed our movement, as well as the queer liberation movement, to apply pressure and accountability to religious institutions that have tried to erode our rights to bodily autonomy. So I'm thinking about the ACT UP and WHAM protests outside St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1989. I'm thinking about our own recent protests as New York City for Abortion Rights outside churches that host anti-abortion activists. And the fact that these bills are being brought forward now because of pro-Palestine protesters, as these righteous protesters outside synagogues protest synagogues that host morally repugnant settler affairs, that should make it clear that these bills are really just about protecting Zionist interests. If they were thinking about protecting other interests, they would have brought these bills forward long ago. And if Speaker Menin and Governor Hochul claim to be allies to our reproductive movement, they would listen to us when we tell them that these bills are extremely dangerous and we do not want them.
Margot, thank you very much. So based on Margot's call, Jimmy, and what you cited before from the head of Planned Parenthood New York, also opposing the 25-foot buffer, it sounds to me like the aim there politically was to win support on both the right and the left, because the left wants to keep protesters away from abortion clinics and the right wants to keep protesters away from synagogues, but it backfired.
Yeah, I think that there was this all-existing linkage in statute, which was cited by legislative sponsors, but there is a certain element that's hard to deny, that including abortion clinics and reproductive health clinics in this was in some ways political cover. Governor Hochul has been a big champion of abortion rights, and in fact, Robin Chappelle Golston was a former aide to the governor before she started leading Planned Parenthood. So I was struck to hear that this break had occurred, and struck that there is this schism within sort of the governor's traditional base. I don't know if it's just people on the political right who are concerned about this. Many of the supporters of this legislation are Democrats. They include State Senator Liz Kruger, Assemblymember Michael Lasher from the Upper West Side, Assemblymember Nili Razik from Queens, people who I don't think of as conservative. I think of them kind of toward the middle or on the left side of the spectrum of the Democratic Party. And so I really do think it's a very interesting issue that has come up, and it has shown that, particularly for Jewish progressives, there is a new dimension that has been really brought to the surface, both by these protests and really in larger context since the October 7th attacks.
Before you each go, one more thing for each of you. Sahalie, for you who cover City Hall, here's one more short clip of City Council Speaker Julie Menin, which I think is going to raise people's eyebrows.
To be clear, these bills in no way infringe on the First Amendment right to protest, which is sacrosanct. The bills don't even talk about protests.
The bills don't even talk about protests. Obviously, City Council member Alexa Aviles in this clip disagrees with that.
We know that these incoherent bills are a message against dissent, in particular against pro-Palestinian voices.
So, Sahalie, do you even understand what she means, Speaker Menin, when she says these bills don't even mention protests?
I think she's leaning into the vagueness of the bill. It's written in a very vague term, in a very vague way, which leads it open to interpretation and gives a bit of a defense in that capacity. But I think it's very clear that these bills were born from protests, regardless of what side you fall on, whether or not there should be greater protections on them or not. That is
Right.
what spurred these discussions that we're having now.
Yeah, even that she tried to go there surprised me. And last thing, Jimmy, while you're here, the state budget remains unpassed since the new fiscal year began on April 1st. I know you've been covering this closely. You and I have been over many times how it's stuck more on policy issues than actual budget issues. Policy issues like delaying the carbon emission limits timetable for the state because Hochul says it adds too much cost to average New Yorkers in the short term. Also limiting damage awards and car crash lawsuits and a few other things. Do you see the outlines yet? Here on, April 24th, of how they get to yes on any of these things?
You know, it's a great question, Brian, and one that in some ways can never be answered. But I do think that there is some progress from what we hear from both lawmakers and allies and aides of Governor Hochul. Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie told reporters this week that there is movement on car insurance. I understand that there have been some tweaks, but that lawmakers are close to an agreement on protecting immigrants. I understand that the climate law changes are still a little bit more up in the air. But the thing that is bogging this down is just the large number of issues that are sort of up in the air, including, as we've mentioned in this segment, this proposal for protest-free buffer zones. So lawmakers have a lot to work through, and when you're simultaneously negotiating a lot of touchy and fraught pieces of policy, if you give a little on one area, it means that you're going to get a little on the other. And so it's a situation where nothing is settled until everything is settled. And then when you layer on top of that $260+ billion worth of state spending, I know that lawmakers still have quite a lot of work cut out for them. One estimate is that it'll take at least a week to deal with some of the spending questions, and that's after a broad agreement on the policy questions. So with that said, the smart minds at the state capitol think that there's no way there will be a budget resolution before the month of May.
Is the tax the rich issue settled? Because Governor Hochul came out with this version that would just place an additional tax on second homes in New York City worth $5 million at least, and Mayor Mamdani likes that, but it doesn't raise nearly as much money as he wanted from the broader tax the rich bills that he supports. But is that their compromise?
It does seem like Mayor Mamdani was happy to declare victory on his campaign promise and his desire to tax the rich with the governor's embrace of that pied-à-terre tax. So I have seen not nearly as much political fervor for increasing income taxes, increasing corporate taxes as Mayor Mamdani has sought. Frankly, Brian, as you and I have talked about this over the last few months, I haven't seen quite as big a groundswell of support for those tax the rich proposals as perhaps one might have expected, given Mayor Mamdani's big election win last year. But so I don't know that there will be a particularly big movement in the final days and hours of budget talks to revive income tax hikes or corporate tax hikes, mostly because there seems to be enough money to do what most of the top leaders of the legislature need to do, and that includes giving relief to Mayor Mamdani and other mayors and elected officials in the states for their municipal budget problems. The other question, though, is what happens to the pied-à-terre tax. Lawmakers have really started to drill down into the details, or the lack of details, as to exactly what this proposal would capture and what it would not capture. So my colleague John Campbell and David Brand wrote a story this week looking at whether that gold-plated triplex at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, owned by that Florida man, Donald Trump, would qualify, whether that would be taxed as a pied-à-terre. And it's really not clear, and it's really complicated given all the nuances of how properties are assessed, whether you're taxing assessed value or market value, and the disparity at times between that assessed value, that market value, and what something is actually being sold for. So I think there's more work to do on the pied-à-terre tax. I saw it die in 2019, despite the magical support from the governor and leaders of the legislature. Real estate interests are powerful in New York City. They own that skyline. And so I don't think you should ever count them out in a political fight until the last bell is rung.
That was a really interesting analysis. I just have to ask you one follow-up before we end this segment on one of the things you said, that the pied-à-terre tax, if it goes through, would give New York City enough money for its needs. But the reason Mamdani wanted a broader tax increase that would generate more revenue is so he could really ramp up a universal child care program in New York State. So would the budget as it might pass, including the pied-à-terre tax, delay his timetable for universal child care, which he has said here on this show and elsewhere is his number one priority?
Well, that was one of the things that Governor Hochul, who has been opposing income and corporate tax hikes in recent months and years, really, I think, pretty savvily took care of. When she first proposed her budget, she included enough funding to start and to make the first steps toward universal child care.
Keyword start.
Yes, keyword start. And the question becomes, feasibly, if you tripled that funding, what more could you feasibly do in the first year or maybe even the second year? Government, of course, works at the speed of government, despite sometimes when you unleash the spending floodgates. So I think that really eroded some of the power of Mamdani's argument, the fact that Governor Hochul put that funding forward without the tax increase. The other thing, Brian, that I think is important context is that the pied-à-terre tax is currently projected or stated to generate $500 million a year. We know that the city's budget estimate, its deficit estimate is about $5.4 billion per year. In addition to the $500 million, New York State has put $1.5 billion onto the table for New York City. And we've already seen Mayor Mamdani and his top aides talk about changes to eligibility for the City FEPS voucher program. There's a discussion about delaying a pension make-up payment that would save money in the annual outlays required. And I think that there's also talk about relief from a state law that requires a reduction in class sizes, which is costly and requires both construction of facilities and the hiring of more staff. So what state leaders have always said, that includes Governor Hochul, Speaker Hastie, and Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins, is that they want to make sure that the city gets the relief it needs, not necessarily the cash, not necessarily the taxing authority, and not necessarily a recurring new revenue stream, but the relief it needs. I think so they feel like they can check off that box by doing what I've just described and deal with future problems when they arise in the future.
Jimmy Vielkind covers state politics and issues for WNYC and Gothamist. Sahalie Donaldson covers City Hall for the publication City and State. Thanks, both of you, for coming on and, among other things, receiving the breaking news on Mayor Mamdani letting one of the buffer zone bills go through, the one covering houses of worship, and vetoing the other, the one covering schools and other educational institutions. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank
Always
you.
a pleasure.